Well, good afternoon, fellow constitutionalists, and welcome to the Thursday edition of the Dan Clements Show. I'm your host, Dan Clements, your constitutional warrior fighting for your right just to be an American. It is October 12th in the year of our Lord 2017. Remember, we're hyphen-free, PC-free zone. God is still in control and He does love you. And I'm broadcasting live from the Hemlock Studios here in the beautiful central Susquehanna Valley in the great Keystone State. And it's a little gloomy out, a little overcast, supposed to be off and on rainy today, thick cloud cover, so that's why it's a little bit darker here in the Hemlock Studios today than normal. One of these days when the money starts coming in, I'm confident that it will eventually, through advertisers and other things, that we will update the studio and the lighting in the studio. But hopefully it's okay now. I mean, I could turn on my overhead light, and that would probably give us a little bit more light without flushing everything out. That looks a lot better. All right. And I do have all my lights on that I normally use in the studio. It's just, it is really dark in here today. Now, I got to do one more thing. I do have to turn the fan on. When I close the door in here, even when it's a little bit cooler out, which it is today, I have 3 computers running in this small office. And they tend to put a little bit of heat out, so I do have to cool myself down a little bit because I do tend to run a little to the hot side, which is my nature. All right, folks, as promised yesterday, I want to finish up an article about the Constitution. I want to give you some updates that I found on the Las Vegas shooter and also on the wildfires that are going on out in California. And along those lines with the wildfires going on, I want to talk to you about the forestry department and why we have so many wildfires and they're so intense. And this is something, this has been an ongoing problem for years. I remember when I first started Back to Basic back in 2008, we talked about some of the wildfires and some of the historical wildfires like Los Alamos. The fire there that was threatening to destroy the laboratories there, and some of the reasons why the fires were so intense. And it goes back to government management. Earlier in the week, we talked about, participatory fascism. All you have to do is look to, one of the best examples of this would be the Indian reservations here in the United States, how they are managed by bureaucracies in Congress, and none of them get it right. This should have never been the model for the American Indians. Matter of fact, putting them on reservations was ridiculous. What should have been done, and what still needs to be done and can be done, is the land actually deeded to them. Not a reservation owned by the federal government. The federal government is not allowed to own land, especially in this manner. It's unconstitutional, so deed it to them. Give them ownership. Give the tribes ownership of the land. Let them do with it as they please, and quit this benevolent patronage that is keeping the American Indian on these reservations in poverty. I used to deliver to there's some reservations in upstate New York, and I delivered government supplies every now and then to them, and those places were... Honestly, I wouldn't let my worst enemy live in these places. They were run down, they were rickety, and yet, the American people and the federal government think it's okay for this. I don't want to dwell too much on that, but I titled the show this morning, Make America Great, MAGA, Make America Great Again, question mark, follow the Constitution. If you want to make America great again, there's 2 basic things you can do. One is follow the Constitution, and these aren't in any particular order of importance. I think the next point would be more important. But the second thing we need to do, and I think the most important thing we need to do, is bring God back out of the shadows in America. Now, I've been watching some things on YouTube the past couple of days, some things that interest me. Some folks I follow on YouTube, like Sargon of Akkad, Carl Benjamin. He was at a conference in Milwaukee earlier this month in October. It was called Mythicon 2017, Mythicon Milwaukee. And to date, I still haven't figured out what these people are about at Mythicon, these mythical beasts at Mythicon. It just, they don't, and I don't know why, but they won't put in there what they're about, what their principles are, what they believe. And after I did some research, after I watched this live airing of Carl Benjamin debating one of the folks at Mythicon who didn't think he should be there to begin with, that didn't want to give him a platform. This guy was, if you want, the poster child for social justice warriors. And I don't even call them warriors, and you know I don't call them warriors. I just use that because that's what most people think of them. If you want to see the poster child for social justice tyrants, this guy, and his name escapes me. I'm still doing some research on this. He is the poster child. And this is the case with most social justice tyrants, most anti-freedom folks out there. They do not have a core set of principles in which they stand on, in which they practice. With them, and throughout this whole exchange with Carl Benjamin. Now, Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, that's his acronym online. He is an old school libertarian. He believes in liberty and freedom. He believes in individual choice. And it shouldn't be about race. It should not be about gender or any other life choices. It should be about merit. And everybody should have, as far as an equal playing field. And that's it. No equality of outcome. No, and what we mean by, and he means and I mean by a level playing field, we all have to have the same opportunities as far as equal opportunity to do what we want to do and how we want to do it, as long as we're not aggressing against somebody else. That's a basic simplification of the principles of freedom and liberty. And the one thing I see here in America that we keep forgetting about, that actually a piece of paper, the supreme law of the land, as it were, for the federal government anyway, and for everybody else, is just real quick here. If you don't know what the supremacy of the Constitution is, if you go to Article 1, Section 8, you'll see all the enumerated powers of the federal government. They have supremacy in those enumerated powers, and that's it. Not everything the federal government does do they have supremacy over the states or we the people, because a lot of what the federal government does today is unconstitutional. Like the U.S. Forestry Service is unconstitutional, and the billions of dollars that's being poured into that venture. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But if we want to make America great again, we have to bring the Constitution back to the forefront of people's minds. We have to bring it back into the public discourse and have a civil conversation about it. There's too many people out there that have a wrong idea what the Constitution is, and they don't even try to go even read the Constitution and study it. It's not hard. It's not hard, but they don't even try to go and read it and study it to find out what it actually says. And folks, how are you supposed to talk against something if you don't know what you're talking against? Now, that doesn't stop these social justice tyrants out there. It didn't stop this gentleman that was sort of debating Carl Benjamin over there. And I'll make sure I put a link up to this. I just want to warn you, there's some adult language in there, not a lot, but there's some in there that you have to be aware of. But this, with a lot of these social justice tyrants, the Democrats, the anti-freedom folks out there, it's all about control. They want to control everything. They want to control outcomes. They want to control, they want to make everything equal across the board. If there's this many blacks in our population, they should be represented in every aspect of our lives at that percentage. Same with Latinos, whatever. To this gentleman here, I thought this was funny. He called himself a feminist. He goes, I'm a feminist. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, dude. And he said he was a guy, but he identified as a feminist. And I'm like, that right there shot signal flares up big time with me. I'm like, uh-oh, we're going for a ride here, and we did. He did not disappoint. And what happened during this whole thing, and I just want to explain this a little bit, getting back to the Constitution, he wasn't standing on any principles. He wasn't standing really for any ideas. And the Constitution is something that we can all grab a hold of, and we can read. We can go back and find out what the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution meant by certain phrases that they used, and what they, a lot of them kept notes. Madison kept a lot of notes about the convention, and he wrote a lot of the letters in the Federalist Papers. And he more than anybody gave us an understanding of what they were talking about when it comes to the Constitution. So it's not something that is out of our reach to understand. It isn't. But there's too many people out there who don't take the time to even educate themselves on what's going on around them. And if we want to make America great again, we have to, it's a good slogan, but we also have to figure out how we do this in a way that protects and promotes freedoms and liberties. Now, there are some things that President Trump is doing that is protecting our freedoms and liberties. One of them is limiting refugees into the country, because as we saw over in Europe, and as we've seen over here in America, the folks have come here before, whether they're refugees or not, they seem to gather into these enclaves, which is okay. I mean, they're allowed to do that, but in these enclaves, then they start trying to dictate to the rest of us that, well, we need Sharia law. And I don't want to get in this big discussion about the ethics of the Sharia law versus the Constitution. Just suffice it to say that it is not compatible. Sharia law is not compatible with freedoms and liberties. It isn't. It's another set of rules that is enacted to enforce control over a group of people. So President Trump has done some good things. He's done some boneheaded things too. These trade deals. And I got an article in here, I don't know if I'll get to it today, where it talks about, let me get the title real quick here down here. He said, protectionism isn't patriotism. Now, President Trump tries to frame the argument that way, that yes, it is patriotism, but it really isn't, because there is a huge, as Donald Trump would say, sector of our economy that survives on imports. They bring these imports in the company, and they sell them to other companies, which in turn sell them to the end users. And there's a huge industry in the United States. It's multi-billion-dollar industry that if we put too many controls on imports, it's going to decimate that part of the economy. And you know where I stand on the economy. I'm a free marketer. The freer the economy, the better. The less government control, the less social justice tyrants control over our economy because they have a perceived injury from one group to another. The less control we have on the economy, the better the economy is going to be, and the better the American people are going to be, because the consumers are going to have prices at market prices. And this applies to every aspect of our economy, from banking to big business and everything. But we have to bring the Constitution back into the public square. I have an article we're going to read here in a little bit. Support for current Constitution hits 10-year low by Rasmussen reports. And we're going to discuss this a little bit, and I'll give you some of my ideas on it. I don't think it's as grim as the poll or the Rasmussen report is making it out to be, because there are some things afoot out there, as it were. But the second thing is the Bible. Now, in watching this Mythicon and some other things, I've been sort of following up on this video because I'm interested. I like to know how people think, what they think about, and how they frame their arguments. There was a couple people that were quote unquote Christians who just come off as control freaks. And that's exactly how they come off. They want to force, and this is where we get the evangelical right, conservative evangelicals in the country. They tend to do this more so than anybody out there. It's all right to preach to folks and sit down and talk to folks about sin in their lives, and that actually culminates into like a national sin. Abortion is a national sin. Pornography is a national sin. even though it affects people on an individual level. There's, it arises to a goodly amount of folks in the country are afflicted by pornography. Goodly amount of folks in the country are affected by abortion, whether it's directly having an abortion or family members and friends and stuff like that are affected outward. But the problem is, there's too many quote unquote Christians out there that are trying to force the gospel on folks. And as I read my Bible, especially the New Testament, there was, and you have to, folks have to make you have to draw a line between the Old and New Testament. In the Old Testament, Jews were born into Judaism. In the New Testament, you were born into Christ when you are of an age where you can recognize that there's sin in your life and you need to do something about it, and you make a mental ascension to, I must follow Christ and do the things he wants me to do, especially how he wants me to become saved. There are specific steps in salvation. And nowhere in the New Testament did I ever see Jesus Christ or his apostles or any of his disciples, was it ever recorded that they went out and forced Christianity on folks. You know what they did? And this goes back to a mindset that we have here in the United States, and this is something that's very important. We need to bring this out before I get into the show here. This mindset that we have here in the United States is, if we think it's good, there ought to be a law. If we think something's good for me and you and maybe our society, we need to go to our Congress, our representatives or senators, and get a law passed and force everybody to participate in this perceived good, social good, or the community good. And they don't realize the damage that they're doing. One, if you're going to deliver a message, or if you want a policy, or if you want folks to do something, the best way to do it is to sit down through civil public discourse and reason it out. Actually have debates about it. That's what this Mythicon 2017 sit down with Carl Benjamin was. It was like a mini debate without a moderator. And Benjamin was trying to keep it civil, although he has some colorful language. But the other gentleman sat across the table from him absolutely wasn't. But anyway, we have to have a civil public discourse about it and sit down and reason things out. That's the only way that we spread God's word. We can't force people to believe things. And I think the Catholic Church and the evangelical Christians of late, Catholic Church for many centuries, evangelical Christians for maybe the past century in America, have done a disservice to Christianity by trying to get regulations to force people to do things that most people would rather have a choice whether they want to follow or not. Now, there are certain moralities, and I don't want to get too far off the subject here. There are certain moralities in life that happen, I believe, to be God-given moralities that I think a lot of people, atheists, Christians, a lot of folks, agnostics, humanists, mythicals, can agree on. Murder's wrong. Stealing's wrong. Bearing false witness is wrong. And there's a lot of other things, beating somebody up beating somebody up because you want to, not because you're defending yourself. That's wrong. And there's a whole moral code out there, whether people like it or not, that we have inside our justice system and that we have in our legal system. And some people argue against that, but I think those are different from the day-to-day Christianity that I live, that I would not force on somebody else. I'm not saying I don't want them to have the same blessings that I have and the same assurances I have for being in Jesus Christ. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is I don't want to force them into that, because nobody forced me into it. They sat down, Al and Dave sat down with me, and through reason of the Scripture brought me to the realization that I needed Jesus Christ in my life, and that I needed to put him on in baptism for the remission of sins. I had a good Bible lesson yesterday on the show that I shared You go check that link out at thedanclemenshow.com. And so these are the two major things. Bring God out of the shadows, but do it in the right way. Don't force people. Sit down and have a reasoned conversation. I believe that's the main reason why a lot of people tune out when they hear that people are Christians. Because too often they've been burned by these people that just rain down hellfire and brimstone on the unbelievers, when in the scriptures that hellfire and brimstone is usually reserved for the believers. If you look at Jesus' interactions with the Sanhedrin and the leaders of the Israelites in his day, and you look at in the New Testament, the admonishments and the cautions weren't to the non-believers. Every one of the epistles in the New Testament was written to Christians for reproof, for instruction, for correction in righteousness. Every one of them. So too many people have a wrong idea about Christianity, and then again we have to bring the Constitution out of the shadows, and we have to bring it into mainstream today and show people through civil public discourse, reason and study, that the Constitution is applicable today as it was when it was written, and just as valuable to the American people today as when it was written, because of the protections and the promotions of freedom and liberty that we find in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, and other founding documents that led up to the creation of the United States of America. It's folks, it's just that simple. It really is. Oh, today's show is being brought to you by Rocky Mountain High Brands. This is the official drink of the Dan Clemens Show. I do not get paid advertisement from these folks. I just made these the official drink. They are hemp-infused drinks. They help with my fibromyalgia. They have several flavors: black tea, mango, a berry energy drink, a lime in your coconut energy drink, a lemonade, which I drink because it doesn't have any caffeine in it. They have power shots. They have bars. They have Eagle Spirit water. That's alkaline water. They got a whole host of things. And just full disclosure on the show here, I do own stock in the company. They are part of my retirement portfolio here. So the Rocky Mountain High Brand is the official drink of the Dan Clemens Show. Today's daily Bible reading comes from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. I want to share that with folks. I want to share that love and that joy that Jesus had, that he went through what he did because he loved us so much. I don't want to force that on anybody. I want to sit down and reason with folks and share that love that God and Jesus has for mankind with them, and let them make the decision. Let them be free to make that decision, whether or not they're going to follow God and Christ and his word and become a disciple. Discipleship is not forced, folks. I can't emphasize that enough. Today's quote meal comes from Jerry Bridges. Our worst days are never so bad that you are beyond the reach of God's grace. And your best days are never so good that you are beyond the need of God's grace. We need God's grace 24/7, 365, folks. In good times and in bad. And we need to recognize that in our lives. Today's short Bible lesson comes from Al Shannon over at biblicalproofwordpress.com. Don't be lost in false hope. Too many people today, and I'll just say this about that and we'll move on. Too many people in our society today and throughout the world live in a false hope. They were taught falsely about Christianity. They were taught falsely about salvation. They weren't given the full truth of God's word. And if you go back to the psalmist, the entirety of God's word is truth. But too many people want to interject or switch out their truth for God's truth. And I don't want that. I don't want no part of that. I want God's truth and God's truth only. because I know that I can foul up pretty bad, and if I can, anybody else can too. Nobody's perfect. And so I'd rather rely on the perfect word and will of God than I would on man's creeds and his ideas. Dave asked a question here, and this is something for you guys. He says, if I get here early, can I click on something so when you begin, the video starts automatically? As it is, I have to keep refreshing the page. I don't know if you have to if you can turn on autoplay on your page. I don't know. Next time I go to a live feed, Dave, I'll try to remember to check on that. But I don't know because I don't start the signal until about a minute. Well, actually, I start the actual streaming signal about 10 seconds into the show. You know, about 10 seconds after the hour is when I actually start the streaming, so I don't get the things from the Blog Talk Radio on the video on there. And quickly, folks, real quick, while we're talking about this, and Dave's on there, and I'm asking him his opinions about this. You heard me talk about a month or so ago about maybe doing some changes with Blog Talk Radio. And I've dug into the analytics of Blog Talk Radio, and I do not receive enough downloads, hits, live listens, or anything on Blog Talk Radio to justify the $40 a month that I spend on Blog Talk Radio. The vast majority of my downloads comes from iTunes and Stitcher. They're my two biggest platforms that I get my download majorities, and I'm thinking that Blog Talk Radio has tweaked the way they distinguish downloads and stuff like that. And my downloads have dropped off tremendously since then. So I am, and it'll probably be over this weekend if I can get it all done over the weekend. I will probably be stepping off of Blog Talk Radio, going with another service that actually hooks up to it's a WordPress plugin service, that they will migrate all my old shows over to the new app. And the new app's only $15 a month, and I control the analytics on it. I control what I want to see on the analytics. And so we're in cost savings for the show. I'm going to drop from $40 to $15 a month with unlimited bandwidth and everything. So I will give this announcement out when it actually happens, and let you know when the last day of my live broadcast on Blog Talk Radio. Now, I'm still going to do YouTube. And I will be recording the MP3 so I can upload it to my service on my website. But I'm going to consolidate everything to the DanClementShow.com. The podcast, show notes, and everything will be right there. So that's the only place you have to go. And again, I'll be migrating everything off of Blog Talk Radio eventually. Once I know that the new service has everything off of Blog Talk Radio and they're working well, then we're just going to put Blog Talk Radio to bed, because and this is something that goes along with everything that's happening on YouTube and Twitter, the deplatforming, the censorship, the tweaking of the statistics, the whole nine yards of the stats, the analytics. Blog Talk Radio, and they've been good to me over the years. With all their tools and everything, but they are run by very liberal folks. And one of the big issues we had back in the day when I was back to basic all those years before I rebranded the show this past year, a little over a year ago, or so, maybe 2 years now. The conservative shows outweighed the liberal shows. I have to go back to that old paradigm. It was like almost 10-1. And there was some lament about that. There were a lot of liberal shows that were mad about that they were allowing these conservatives to be on the platform because of our message. And again, liberals don't want a civil public discourse. Liberals, anti-freedom folks out there, those elitists, the progressives, the Democrats, they think they know best or better than you about everything. And they don't like freedom and liberty. They like to control everything. And I believe this is what's happened over the years on Blog Talk Radio, is that this is filtered up to the owners and the managers of Blog Talk Radio. And that's why we had, for the longest time, I was hitting, up until they redid it things earlier this year, I was hitting 1,500 downloads a day on a regular basis. On a regular basis, folks. And then when they went through and changed their analytics and everything, I dropped down to like 0. And I'm like, what in the world's happening? And I'm still getting, I still get a lot on Stitcher. I still get a lot on YouTube. A lot of folks follow me on iTunes is the biggest aggregator that I have. So I'm just letting you know, and Dave, I want your thoughts on this. But I'm pretty sure, as things are going now, the projection I'm on now, that I'm going to consolidate everything onto the danclemenshow.com and leave Blog Talk in the past, but again, still do my YouTube. I'm not going to leave YouTube unless they kick me off the platform. I think this is a wonderful platform. It's a springboard to a lot of other things that I want to do, and I can concentrate more on this instead of having to worry about live broadcasting on Blog Talk Radio. The way I'm going to do it in the future, I won't be live broadcasting the podcast at all. I'll just be uploading the podcast for folks. And we'll see where that goes from there, but I will be a huge cost savings on the show. So, almost 2/3 less, or it will be 2/3 less, or close to 2/3 less, excuse me. My math is fuzzy. Anyway, that's where we're going. So, Dave, just to answer Dave's question real quick there, I'll have to check some live streams. I don't know. I clicked on one the other day that wasn't up yet on my TV, on my YouTube channel on TV, and as soon as it started, everything kicked on. It refreshed and boom, it was up. So I don't know if it's with your computer. I'll have to check that out, Dave, but that's a good question. All right. This Rasmussen's reports was put out on October 11th, a couple days ago. Support for the current Constitution hits 10-year low. Polarization among today's voters is glaringly apparent when they're asked whether the U.S. Constitution should be changed or left alone, with support for the Constitution as is at its lowest level in a decade. A new Rasmussen's Reports National Telephone Online Survey finds 48% Americans of likely U.S. voters, still believe the U.S. Constitution should be left as written. It's almost half. It's down. It used to be 59% in 2015. And that's a decline of 13% since we first asked this question in 2007. 46% say constitutional changes are needed, with 37% favoring minor changes and 9% who believe major changes are in order. Just 1%, however, call for the scrapping of the Constitution completely and starting over. And me and surveys and polls, I'm real skeptical about them, so I'm going to take these numbers with a grain of salt, but it lines up with my experience of me talking with folks on social media and elsewhere. These numbers sound pretty good. I mean, the radicals that want to totally do away with the Constitution, even though they get some of the most play on the mainstream media and elsewhere, are only 1%. They're only 1%. So, they're a fringe. And you heard me say that we don't legislate on the margins like that. Let's see here. The survey of 1,000 likely voters was conducted on October 2nd through the 3rd, 2017 by Rasmussen Reports. The margin of sampling error is plus or minus 3% and percentage points with a 95% level of confidence. And out of all of the surveys and stuff like that, I like Rasmussen. They do a fairly good job. No one's perfect, but they do a fairly good job. But I want to go back up and look at these numbers. So this latest survey says 48% of likely U.S. voters still believe the Constitution should be left alone as written. Okay? Should be. Should be left alone. Now, that's not written in stone. It's not, thou shalt not rewrite the Constitution. It should be. I think this 48% can be persuaded. Now, they're saying that 46% say constitutional changes are needed, with 37% of those folks favoring minor changes and only 9% who believe in major changes. So even that 9% of that 46% is still a very small fraction of the population of the United States of America. And this is where I want to get at. Because of social media, because of the internet, because of YouTube, because of programs like this that talk up not as much as I should be, but I do from time to time touch on the Article 5 Convention of the States and talking about the amendment process to the Constitution. And there has been a lot of talk about amending the Constitution, but doing it in a way that we're not going to open it up to all sorts of ills and outright appeal in that. In this day and age, that would be a disaster for the United States of America. But that 46% say that some changes are needed, and they are correct, because George Mason, one of the ardent supporters of the Article 5, especially the states, you know, in the original Constitution, they had the amendment process for Congress. But George Mason and some others were saying, what happens if we get a Congress that is being real ornery towards the American people, and they need change? We need changes in the Constitution to correct a few things, but they don't want to do it. Have you ever heard of Congress talking about term limits for themselves? Actually putting forth a constitutional amendment to limit their terms in office plus the Supreme Court. It's not going to happen through Congress. Congress folks are not going to limit their own power, their own time in Congress. And George Mason and them argued, and it was unanimously voted on by everybody at the convention to put in the second proviso of changing the Constitution. That is the Article 5 Convention of the States. So, there has been a lot of talk, and there's been a lot of groundswell about this, a lot of angst against it, and a lot of organization against it by George Soros and his folks, because he knows if we get through some of the common sense amendments to the Constitution that has been proposed, especially in Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments, it's almost a game ender for them. If we go in and repeal, again, you keep hearing me say this, one of the best things we can do for the country is repeal the 17th Amendment and give the states back their check on the federal government. That would go a long way to stopping a lot of this garbage that gets passed or is passed for constitutional legislation, which it isn't. A lot of this isn't. Just repealing the 17th Amendment would go a long way. Two more pieces of legislation in the amendment process would be repealing the 16th Amendment and also repealing, making an amendment that makes it unconstitutional for the federal government to control the economy. What do I mean by that? The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve. Everything, interest rates, all that kind of stuff is opened up to the free market. It's gotten out of the control of politicians and lobbyists and corporatists out there in the big banks and the corporations. It takes it out of their control. Another common sense amendment to the Constitution is limiting the power of lobbyists in D.C. You know, forcing lobbyists to go back and visit the congressmen, and if we get rid of the 17th Amendment, it wouldn't do them any good to go to senators anymore, because they have to go to the states and lobby at the state level to get the senators, to get the states to make the senators do what they want to do. So you almost, with eliminating the 17th Amendment, you take out half of Congress out of the way of lobbyists. Because I don't think the lobbyists are going to go to the state level, and that'll cost them a lot of money if they have to go to every state to get them to do what they want them to do, and a lot of times that may not happen. So that might be time wasted and money not well spent. So then they'd have to concentrate on the House of Representatives. But if we force them to only be able to talk to the representatives when they're back in their home districts, which is that's another one of those common sense amendments that I've heard, I think it's a good idea. Maybe you don't think it's a good idea, but we need to have a public discourse on it. We need to have a public discussion on the whole thing. And so, even though they say it's down from 59%, there's still the question. I think the question, a new Rasmussen report, National Telephone Online Survey, finds that 48% of likely U.S. voters still believe the U.S. Constitution should be left as written. Okay, and the survey wording, if we want to go over to that, I just want to I'll get it up here in a second here, folks. Let me pull it up so everybody can see it here except for the folks on Blog Talk Radio. I do apologize for this. I really do. But this is important. I believe this is very, very important, even more important than the wildfires and everything that's going on out there. This is the actual wording. Let me get over here to the desktop. This is the actual wording here. He said, which best describes your view towards changing the Constitution? Should be left alone? Does it require minor changes or major changes, or would we scrap it and start over again? Now, those are pretty straightforward questions. I have no problem with those questions whatsoever. Like I said, I think they're pretty straightforward, and that's the way survey questions should be. There should be no ambiguity. If they could be worded better, okay. Let's have a discussion about that, but let's also don't just out of hand dismiss those, if you know what I mean. So, those are the questions that were there, and I think they were pretty straightforward. But I do believe that we need to educate people further on the Constitution and also the need to possibly amend it. Because I want to get back to one more point and we'll move on. The Founding Fathers, George Mason, and those that thought that we needed this extra protection in the Constitution for we the people, said that they're not, they may not be the smartest people ever to walk the face of the earth, and they're just human like anybody else, and they could have made mistakes in the Constitution. So they needed to give the people a way to amend the Constitution to correct their mistakes. That's reasonable to me, folks. That is totally reasonable to me, and this is where I sort of part ways with the Constitution Party and your thoughts on this. They want to put out the idea that there's no way that you can limit the Constitution conventions, and I think there is. I think each state who sends delegates to that can pass laws because those delegates live in their state and they're under that jurisdiction and they're sent there by the authority of the state. I've heard arguments against that, saying, well, no, it'd be the people of the state. And it's like, you're splitting hairs here. You're splitting hairs. But anyway, there are some mistakes in the Constitution. There are some mistakes with earlier amendments to the Constitution, like the 16th and 17th Amendment. There definitely was with the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. That was repealed eventually because that was about the dumbest thing in the world to have passed. So I'm not worried about this survey, because of the information that's being passed out to American citizens that 46% say that there needs to be some type of change. There needs to be some, and 37% of them favor minor changes. To me, that's still a vast majority of the American people. If you add those up, that's still the vast majority of American people that either leave it, it should be left as it's written, or minor changes to it. We're not talking about massive shifts in the Constitution here. So, like I said, I'm not worried about that at all. I really ain't. I ain't. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Dave. I'm not worried about that. All right. As promised, let's get over to and talk a little bit about the Las Vegas shooting. Now, I have two articles on this. I'm not going to belabor it too long here, but the Las Vegas shooting bump stock lawsuit to test U.S. gun industry's immunity to prosecution. Now, folks, this is very, very important because this goes back to Sandy Hook. And this goes back to gun cases, lawsuits against gun manufacturers, trying to sue them because people misused their product. Okay? And the courts threw them out. And again, this bump stock, I have mixed feelings about this. I think there can be an honest debate about it, and I think there should be a debate about this. Whether civilians should be able to own bump stocks is up to debate. I'm struggling with this because I don't like gun regulation, because you start regulating one thing and it goes on and on and on and on, and it keeps going on. And the point, like I said, the point I want to bring out about this is that the lawsuits against the weapon manufacturers, the NRA, nor the weapons manufacturers are culpable in this. They put out a product that it needs a human being to actually function properly. And this bump stock does not, I repeat, does not fundamentally change. It's called the searing or the sear pin mechanism in there in the receiver. And if you're on YouTube, I'm circling the receiver down here. This is what they call the lower part of the receiver with the trigger and the trigger guard and everything. It's inside this mechanism that's changed to put it on select fire, either semi-automatic or full automatic, or some versions of the M16 had a tri-burst setting. I think the A1 had a tri-burst setting, not a full auto. I have to go back and research that. But anyway, the bump stock, if you go look at videos on YouTube, I'm not going to show them I won't put any links up. You just go look. The bump stock, in order for that to work properly, does not work like a fully automatic, a select fire weapon. Because you have to hold the stock forward, and as you have to hit that trigger, release it and hit it again while you're holding the stock forward, and then it starts going into its simulated full automatic load. Now, holding the stock forward like that reduces accuracy tremendously. Now, with the Mandolin Bay shooter, the Las Vegas shooter, he didn't need to be real accurate to pour lead down in a crowd that size. Didn't need to be, and I understand that. However, under current gun laws right now, the bump stock does not change the receiver on the weapons. It causes it to simulate full automatic, but any real soldier, especially an infantryman, a rifleman that has been trained in the United States military, will tell you that a rifleman is discouraged from using full auto. That's why, and I'm pretty sure the M16A1 with the tri-burst setting was not full auto. You can only do you put it on tri-burst on the selector, you pull your trigger, and it releases 3 bullets down range. And they figured out 3 bullets is more than enough, and after 3 bullets, your accuracy varies greatly. And they'll tell you that, folks, in order to be an effective infantry rifleman, you gotta put your bullets where they need to be. And full auto will not let you do that. Full auto is usually used for suppression, to keep the heads of the enemy down, so your riflemen on select fire, on semi-automatic or tri-burst, could kill the enemy. You know, get their get their accuracy down where they can start taking the enemy out. It's just that simple. And this bump stock does nothing for accuracy. Any of the ones on YouTube that are worth their salt that actually demonstrate this will tell you that there is no accuracy with a bump stock at all. Again, in this crowd at the concert, you didn't need accuracy. You just had to get general location. Okay? So we're going to follow these lawsuits, folks. I don't think they're going to go anywhere. But, you know, Congress can change the laws and add this to the Firearm Act to make you get a license to get this bump stock. Now, whether they still classify it as a full automatic or not, that remains to be seen. Again, it's not. It simulates it. But even a rifle, a select fire rifle like an M16, when you put it on full auto, you're not having to hold the stock forward as you're holding this bump stock back here. This bump stock's doing this on your arm the whole time. And if you watch them on the video, like I said, that gun's all over the place. And on a regular fully automatic weapon, you can pull that up to your shoulder, and you can squeeze it off on full automatic and control it somewhat better, or way better than you could have bump stock. But even then, your accuracy isn't there, because they determine after 3 shots, the barrel starts lifting. You're having to compensate for barrel lift, and it throws your aim off and everything. So this is going to be very interesting to see what's going on here. And this is actually from the Independent, and this is by Polly Mosendez on October 12th of this year. Now, The next story is about, now this comes from news.com. Las Vegas gunman Stephen Paddock used incendiary bullets. And this is something that's coming out right now, that he was using these incendiary bullets. And it's important to understand why he was doing this. Stephen Paddock was not insane. He had an exit strategy. It hasn't been confirmed yet. There was allegedly some binary explosives in his car, but the police haven't confirmed this yet. They just said that they found explosives in his car that was at the hotel. But he was shooting these incendiary bullets. And if you look, there's the picture down here, right here. I'm sorry on Blog Talk Radio you can't see this, but on YouTube you can see this. This is a picture from the airport looking at Mandalay Bay. I'll get that out. Where Air Force One, that's a picture of Air Force One. That's how close the hotel was to these fuel tanks. I don't know if they actually show the fuel tanks. They have some other diagrams there of the. They were showing pictures of the fuel tanks earlier. I don't know what happened. They must have changed them. But from the hotel room, he had a clear shot at these. They're like 430,000 gallon fuel tanks. Now, if he was able to, the incendiary rounds would not punch holes in the tanks. And we're not even sure how many of these he used. They're still investigating this. But in order for an incendiary round to work, he would have had to puncture the tanks first and get them leaking. And it's just like tracer rounds. When we used to use tracer rounds, we had our platoon sergeants usually carried in their rounds, like every fifth round was a tracer round. So if there was an enemy target that they were trying to zero in on, or the M60 could do the same thing, they could light them up with these tracer rounds, especially at night. But you can also see tracer rounds during the day and focus in and target these tracer rounds in there so people can see that. So these incendiary rounds are actually a little bit more potent. They're white phosphorus, but they will not penetrate the metal. Now, if they had an M203 with a Willie Pete round in it, he could have put a couple on top of the tank and burnt through the top. I don't know if it would have ignited them or not, but I wouldn't want to be around to try to find out. So he did, in my mind, he did have an exit strategy here, but he couldn't, for whatever reason, he couldn't get the tanks to blow up. And I don't know if they actually checked the tanks to see if he even penetrated them. I don't know if the bullets had enough of a punch to actually get through the shell of those tanks, because they're not thin. They're not thin at all. So that's just a couple of things that I found out. There's a lot of other stories over Google News. If you put in Las Vegas shooter or shooting, you can come up with a lot of these other articles and stories and stuff like that. I'll let you go over and check those out. As promised yesterday, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening out in California. There are oodles of forest fires or wildfires in Northern California. Now, Santa Rosa has been in the news, and that's a huge town in Northern California. And my aunt and uncle just live west of that in Sebastopol, California. And they're saying that fires aren't reaching there yet, but, who knows? And so there's been 11 deaths in there. More than 100 people reported injured. About a dozen different wildfires scorched more than 119,000 acres in the state, causing more than 20,000 people to be evacuated. Another 100 people were missing. So we don't even know what the death toll is going to be until they go through everything. They're going to have to check all the houses, the cars, for victims, and this is going to be a gruesome task for these folks. Officials said 7 people died in a Sonoma County city of Santa Rosa. 2 people died in Napa County, and 1 each were killed in Mendocino County and Yuba County. The fires began to spread Sunday night, driven by dry conditions and winds that reached 50 miles an hour, according to Director Ken Pimlott of the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. The winds led to extreme rates of spread and volatile burning conditions, CAL FIRE said. So that as of yesterday morning, and I didn't see any updates to this yet. It's an article over at Western Journalism by Jack Davis, and there's 11 people dead, 100 people missing. So I got to believe that death toll is going to be rising again. And this is one of these things, folks. When do you talk about these things, right? When do you talk about these wildfires? When do you talk about these bureaucracies that oversee all this, that actually the National Forest Service, that is a bureaucracy that's within the Department of Interior that takes billions of dollars a year, and they don't manage anything. They do not manage the forests at all. When I was in Boy Scouts, Camp Levine is a camp up north of Berwick. It's a Boy Scout camp up there, a Montour Columbia Council. It's a council camp. They had a summer where a kid was injured pretty bad, and some others almost got injured because of a tornado that came through there and took some treetops down of these trees that were so massive they were dying. And yet there were people, they were environmentalists on the council that would not allow these trees to be taken out. They're old growth. But the council did a study that got them to agree, well, let's do a study and get some core samples of these trees and see what's going on. A lot of these trees they were having problems with are coming down, and Boy Scouts were camping underneath them during summer camp and during tornado season, was that they were rotten in the center. And I see I'm almost out of time. Spent too much time on my monologue, but that's okay. We will pick up on this tomorrow. We got an hour and a half show tomorrow. We will pick up on this. It's called The Politics of Monetizing Wildfires, a burgeoning government business enterprise with a question mark. This is by Captain William E. Simpson over to westernjournal.com. Now, he posted this clear back in July. But real quick here, the one thing I wanted to point out here was a response to an email. And it said, removing fuel loaded reduces wildfire risk and intensity equals save money. Environmental lawsuits using the Equal Access to Justice Acts are largely to blame. They sue every single management plan that involves tree cutting, even in the burned areas. None of this is news and is not within the control of the Board of Supervisors, so I'm sure you are aware. I could go on and on, but have a meeting, yet get my drift. This has been going on for many, many years, folks. And again, this is something that needs to be addressed. We have this participatory fascism going on in the United States government. And we have these bureaucracies that are controlling these national and state forests that are not managing them. And if they're not managing, if they do try to manage them, then you have environmentalists that are bringing lawsuits against them. And then things are just going from bad to worse. These fires, instead of just being small fires, they turn out to be cauldrons and crucibles because of all the excess fire or the excess fuel that's actually going into the fires. So, well, folks, that's the music. That's the end of the show. But fear not, I'll be back with you tomorrow for Free For All Friday, and we'll pick up where we left off about this story and many, many more stories that I have. If you want to check out all the stories I look at every day, please go to thedanclemenshow.com and check out the show notes pages. I'm your Constitutional Warrior. Remember, if you aim at nothing, you hit it every time. Have a great rest of the day, and God bless, and we'll see you tomorrow.